Good evening. I'm Seymour Amos. No, I'm not. We will leave that for another night. These are special days. Different days. Days that I wish I could spend with all of you, with everyone who's been so kind to join us on this night, and with that primal pleasure of a fire. Now, if someone's signaling me, hey, I can't hear you, Sam. Is that the case? No. They're all signaling thumbs up. Some of them are signaling we can't hear you. No, those are thumbs. Good. I'll take it from the top. Let me introduce. I could tell you that my life story. How did I get into whiskey? No, you didn't come here to hear why I care about whiskey. But I care about all these, as I was saying, these are strange times, and I am concerned that somebody's going to mention the E word tonight. If they do, all of the presenters have agreed they will donate £10 to a charity of their choice. Someone will keep track of that. There will be no E word talk. The L word is another profanity. We are in the UK entering another L period, L2. Some of us welcome it, some of us dread it, and some of us had a pretty hard run until now. These are our stories changing all the time, just when we thought they were written. Don't want to hear me talk about that. I want to introduce the guests that have joined us this evening. Most importantly, the primal comfort and the primal pleasure of a burning fire. Dave Worthington, thank you for the fire. John Campbell, Laphroaig Distillery, thank you for being here.
Hi, Tom.
The most generous man in whiskey, Charles Maclean. Good to see you. Dr. Nick Morgan.
Thank you for having me, Sam.
Gemma.
Hello.
Paterson with Balvenie. Hello. Dave Sweep Broom. Thank you for being here, Dave.
Hello, folks.
Andy Weir, all from New York.
Hi, everyone.
Hi, everybody.
Tammy Jackson, thank you for being here. We've got the guests have arrived. I think it's probably time that we offer them a beverage.
Good plan.
To be able to help in that department.
I have the sound effects going.
You can hear in the background, it is Guy Fawkes Day, a strange tradition. I have to say, we do celebrate it in Canada. Are you familiar with the Tammy before you live in the UK?
Yes, very not as big as it is here.
It's a strange one, though, because it's a 400-year-old tradition of, I guess, but it's a weird one, though, isn't it, Dave? Because it's really, it's Samhain. There are fire festivals this time of year in many different cultures and religions. Yeah. One's pasted on top of the other, but this one's interesting because it's Catholic terrorists being smoked.
Yeah.
But it's I mean, it used to be the great Pope burning ceremony, and I think that was considered at some point to be a bit, beyond the pale. So instead of the Pope burning, they went for Guy Fawkes instead.
Yeah, it's kind of weird one because my grandmother's maiden name was Fox, so I always had I also kind of claimed ancestry with Guido himself. I remember once doing a rum tasting for a bonfire society in the town of Lewis, which is just next to Brighton, which has or had until this year. Massive bonfire celebration. And I talked to them about this because they do still burn an effigy of the Pope. And I went, what's this kind of burning the Pope thing? And they went, oh, no, it's not the Pope. It's a Pope.
A Pope.
It's a specific Pope that we're burning. And I told them that still wouldn't go down too well into Glasgow. But, obviously it's okay in Lewis. And probably in Lewis as well, Gemma, if she's still there. But there we go.
But this year, what would you throw on the fire? Think about it. You don't have to answer now. Let's get a drink in our hands. Tammy, can you help us with the toddy?
I can do. Tonight, I am very graciously gifted with Aerolite Lindsay to make you this delicious hot toddy. I'm keeping it simple. We are going to stick with a fairly traditional recipe. So get your drams ready. I've got my mug ready. And then I am going to pop 40 ml of the Aerolite Lindsay into my mug. This will get you warming up for the rest of the show. Right, and I've got some lemon juice going in, so it's about 20 ml. I've got fresh lemon. Just squeeze half a lemon in or measure it out as 20 ml. Straight into your mug. This is quite a juicy lemon. I like mine a bit citrusy, but you can tweak this to taste. There are no rules. It's just about having a nice warm drink in your hand, a good base spirit, and great company, which we're definitely in tonight. Right, and then cheers. So you can use honey water, so dilute about a tablespoon of honey to equal amount of water. Makes it all runny. My honey is quite runny, so I'm just going to drip some into my mug. I'm a honey addict, so I absolutely love this. Pop that in.
I just wanted the world to see Struan's bum, or whoever's bum that is in the background. Hi, Struan.
You've got an audience here.
And then I've got some egg, just to pop in there. And some hot water. Fill it up. And then we're just going to give it a nice stir. Make sure that honey's dissolved if you're just using a teaspoon of honey in there. And then to garnish, you can use a slice of lemon. You can stud it with some cloves for some extra spice. Quite simply done. Weave them in like that. This one's a bit trickier than normal. Right, so you could spike your lemon, or I like a peel of lemon because I get to express the oils into the mug. It's studded. Pop that on there. And a cinnamon stick. And there we have Aerolite Lindsay hot toddy. Cheers, everybody.
Well, that looks delicious. Could use a warmer.
Now, the other thing is we have some delicious marshmallows, toast them, and have them on the side. So that's another suggestion.
Well, that would work very well, especially with whiskey. But did toddy begin with whiskey? What are the origins of toddy anyway? Like hot toddy, those words are sort of synonymous. They always go together. But was whiskey the original spirit?
Well, I think it was because the name came from the Todian well, didn't it, Nick? Just on Arthur's Seat in Edinburgh. And
Yes.
but it was invented because the whiskey tasted so filthy in those days. We're going back to the 18th century at least, and it was harsh. It was brand new, and it needed to be perked up. And so lemon and sugar, lemon and honey was the crucial thing. And then, obviously there are many variations, such as you were saying, cinnamon and cloves and so on. But I think, so far as I'm aware, it was a Scottish invention to make whiskey palatable.
It kind of grew from the toddy was essentially like a single serve of the whiskey punch. The whiskey punch was the great communal drink of the 18th century, and you've got these fantastic accounts of travellers from the lowlands up to the highlands with bags of lemons strung around the necks of their horses. The lemons being gifts for their hosts in the grand houses to be used, because there wasn't a huge amount of acidulant available. Other than rowan berries, and there's a nice reference to rowan berries being used as an acidulant on the Isle of Jura at some point. But the whiskey punch becomes really popular at the beginning of the 19th century, and there's that lovely account in Meg Dodds's book of recounting Hogg, the famous poet, making a punch screeching hot, and plumping in the sugar and the lemon and stirring it round and round, and giving this hot whiskey punch to everyone. But then it became more gentrified into, I suspect, the toddy, which then became popular in the mid to late 18th century. Something that was beautifully researched by my dear colleague, Dr. Morgan, in his estimable tome.
I'm just going to read you a short bit from this, but before I do that, I would say that one of the things that surprised me when I was doing the research for the book was to realize how pervasive toddy drinking was throughout the 19th century. And it really seems to have been, for the most part, the respectable face of whiskey drinking. So, you could go and drink whiskey in a dram shop if you wanted to, and heaven knows what you might be drinking there. Or you could drink whiskey at home, or in bars and hotels. Alexander Walker, son of John, who ended up in a bit of dispute with the Midland Railway Hotel, which is the St Pancras Hotel in London, over them selling counterfeit Johnny Walker whiskey. But in the course of the correspondence that went on about that, he said how much he always stayed at the Midland Hotel, and he used to go out to the theatre when he was in London. And he said how much he liked coming back to the hotel after being at the theatre and seeing people sitting in the lounge drinking his whiskey hot, as in a hot toddy. So hot toddy is really pervasive and respectable whiskey drinking. And I came across a quote in an Ayrshire newspaper, which was written by someone who'd actually been to the Netherlands and was complaining that there didn't seem to be, he was given Hollands and Geneva, but there didn't seem to be a real national drink. And he said there was no national drink like, this is a quote, like that great Gulf Stream of toddy, which flows through my native land, softening our natural severity, tempering our old fanaticism, and modifying our rugged climate. It's just as a historian, that's one of those quotes you cry when you find it because it's just so wonderful, you know.
That is really beautiful. I've got a kind of anecdotal thing about toddy drinking in the 19th century. My great grandfather, Thomas Moffat, was a schoolmaster in Forgandenny, which is just outside Perth, and he kept diaries for all of his adult life, which had been passed down into the family. And my mother and indeed my mother and my aunts and uncles always maintained that he was teetotal. But then when you read the diaries, you realise that he every Friday night he would walk into Perth or go into Perth to indulge in a game of billiards and drink toddies with his cronies. This is about the 1870s, 1880s. And I always kind of maintained at that point that obviously he was a drinker, and my mother always used to kind of resist that fact. And then my cousin Jim found this great book about the history of Forgandenny. And there's this wonderful thing in the history of Forgandenny about the curling club of Forgandenny. And it kind of goes like that. There were two people who, an account of one particular meeting of the curling club, where two people were presented with curling stones, incidentally, with stone hewn from where my grandfather was born, bizarrely. And then it was Thomas Moffat was elected my lord of the occasion, and the drinking and a fining game followed to raise money. And I quote, "The evening was so fast and furious, it became absolutely necessary to appoint an assistant officer in the person of Brother William Gourlay." And then the author of the book says, "The welcoming nature of the curling club members achieved some notoriety." So, in other words, this became just a mental toddy drinking club. And on one occasion, when the Forgandenny team, including my great grandfather, went along expecting multiple toddies and fine feasts, went along a member of another village, or the other team of another village, presented him with a rather depressing meal, and one of them wrote a poem disparaging this. And I quote, "A curler's cheer in Auld Lang Syne was beef and green and Scottish wine. But there has been a sair decline when curlers feast, and for the lack of better dine on sic a beast. Lament wi' me, O curlers keen, let sot tears drap frae your een, nae mair will seen as aye we've seen our stains a baimin. Sin we hae noch to treat a freen, but smeek it herring." In other words, don't give us kippers, give us booze. Toddy drinking.
The other thing that's interesting is that, and it's quite appropriate that this evening's toddy's been made with Sam's Aerolite Lindsay, is that the sort of whiskey, so like the whiskey that Johnny Walker were making, Old Highland Whiskey and other sort of famous brand companies now, but the sort of whiskey that was used in toddy was very different from the whiskey that became popular in the late 19th and certainly in the 20th century. It was much heavier, it was much peatier, it was oily. There are some great descriptions of toddy whiskey. You know, as soon as people stopped drinking toddies and moved on to whiskey and soda, they needed a much lighter style of blend, which is far more similar to what we would be used to today, I think.
That's absolutely fascinating, Nick. And it's one of the great revelations in the book, that the way in which whiskies changed and blends changed to suit the consumer expectation and the occasion. You know, and then we tend to think, and those people who believe in this kind of golden age, the whiskey was always the same until very recently, and then suddenly it declined. It's always shifted. It's always shifted to actually to the consumer.
I did think for a moment that Charlie was going to play us his Jew's harp then. I'm not sure. Which would be a great surprise, Charlie.
I'm ready for the solo. Charlie, you let us know when you want to start playing. You are not on mute. You're ready to start playing. Tammy, probably the simpler, maybe one of the oldest cocktails you've made, for cocktail's sake. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me.
And we'll take
Thanks,
care.
Tammy.
We'll let you get on with your evening and fight the fireworks outside.
Have a good one.
You too. Cheers. That was Tammy for cocktail's sake. Now, the four of us sat around. I'm going to get out of here. Charlie, I'd love to watch you read a story, a bedtime story, to our friends Nick and Dave.
Oh well, this is very appropriate because I'm going to read a passage from my favorite whiskey book, and here it is in its original edition. Can you see it there? It's Whiskey by Aeneas MacDonald.
Not yours, Nick.
Okay, you can see that's the original edition. 1930, it's published in 1930. Now this is the contemporary edition, which is still very much available. And I did notice when I dug it out this evening that on the front cover there's a quote from my learned friend Mr. Broom, "The finest whiskey book ever." And on the back cover, along with my quote, which and I say, if I could take only one whiskey book to a desert island, it would be Aeneas MacDonald's Whiskey. And lo and behold, at the foot of the final comment, Dr. Nicholas Morgan, the must-read whiskey book, a wonderfully opinionated blend of facts, fallacies, and prejudices, best enjoyed with a dash of soda. It is a fabulous book, and this edition by Canongate, which was published not that long ago. Not very. No, I can't remember, but it's still available. And it was done by Ian Buxton, who did a lot of research into who Aeneas MacDonald was a pseudonym, and he did a lot of research into who he was. He was really a polemicist. He was. I got a little note here. Ian writes, he was a Jacobite, a believer in lost causes, a patriot, and also a survivor. He was also described as the best hated man in Scotland, which is probably one of the reasons why he used a pseudonym. The other reason was, of course, that his family, he came from Leith, and his family were rabidly teetotal. And so he didn't want to publish, he didn't want to upset his mother by publishing under his own name. And Buxton says also, written in haste, sorrow, and righteous anger, Whiskey is simply a joy to read. And I would agree with that. It's a wonderful book. So I'm going to read a passage from this, and then if time allows, I'll read a passage from another favorite book of mine, but you can keep me right on that, Sam. He says, I pass on to another type of enemy, the men who drink whiskey. With pain and not without hope that they may yet be saved, let us number their sins. Foremost among these is that they drink not for the pleasure of drinking, nor for any merits of flavor or bouquet which the whiskey may possess, but simply in order to obtain a certain physical effect. They regard whiskey not as a beverage, but as a drug, not as an end, but as a means to an end. It is indeed a heresy of the darker sort, doubly to be condemned, in that it lends a sad, superficial plausibility to the sneers of the precious. Whiskey suffers its worst insults at the hands of the swillers, the drinkers to get drunk, who have not organs of taste and smell in them, but only gauges of alcoholic content. The boozers, the let's have a spot, and make it a quick one gentry, and all the rest who dwell in a darkness where there are no whiskies, but only whiskey, and of course, soda. Yet it may be unjust to lay on the souls of such false friends the burden of whiskey's present lamentable plight, this is written in 1930, published in 1930. whisky's present lamentable plight, when it has become less a delight to the mouths of men than an item in a pharmacopoeia, and is drunk for all sorts of illegitimate reasons, as by journalists to quieten conscience, by the timid to avert catarrh, by inferior poets to whip up rhymes, and by commercial travellers to dull the memory of rebuffs. For those whose business it is to encourage the sale of whisky are not without guilt in this matter. They bandy no words about the aesthetic aspect of their wares. Their talk is all of moral and physiological advantage. It does you good after a hot, tiring day, now that the cold weather is coming. The doctor recommends it. This is to be deplored, for it plays directly into the hands of those who look on whisky at its lowest as a mere brute stimulant, who believe that one bottle of whisky resembles another very much as one packet of Goldflake cigarettes, another packet of Goldflake cigarettes, and whose nearest approach to discrimination is to say, small Scotch, please, instead of the Silmore Catholic, a small whisky. This is my favorite paragraph. As a result, there's been a tendency to abolish whisky from the table of the connoisseur to the saloon bar and the golf club smoke room. The notion that we can possibly develop a palate for whisky is guaranteed to produce a smile of derision in any company except that of a few Scottish lairds, farmers, gamekeepers, and bailies, relics of a vanished age of gold when the vintages of the North had their students and lovers. Isn't that great? A polemic. I mean, he wasn't terribly keen on Glenn Scott.
Well, you know, I mean, the thing is, Charlie, polemic it is, and it's a beautifully written as a polemic. It's brilliant, but I think it needs to be judged, you know, against a number of factors. One is he was a plagiarist, so a lot of it is actually copied from Nettleton, particularly from Nettleton's last chapter.
Indeed.
He was, as everyone should know, at the extreme right end of the early Scottish nationalist movement, and was certainly a racist, without doubt.
Very anti-Catholic.
Well, yeah, he was anti-Irish. He was a racist as far as the Irish were concerned. And I'm sure his views on Semitism weren't particularly great to hear either. And he was, in the context of whiskey, I always call him the first whiskey snob. And actually, although I sort of laugh when I read the book, I actually find his views quite objectionable. Really, quite objectionable.
But it's wonderfully, fearlessly outspoken.
And then he went and worked for Lord Beaverbrook and became Beaverbrook's stooge when he was, well, in the 30s. Let's just leave it there. So,
yeah, no, he became a distinguished journalist, and indeed he got an OBE before he died. And but he's a mysterious creature by all accounts. And but I love it. I love whiskey. It's a view from 1930.
It's almost like a backwoodsman fighting the last battle against the Renaissance. The Renaissance being the rise of blended whiskey, which had already happened. I mean, it was a done deal, but he was fighting this sort of ridiculous last battle.
Yeah.
How are we going to follow this, guys? How are we going to follow this, Andy and Gemma? You guys keep going. Absolutely incredible.
I'm at a loss, Sam. You're going
We have to keep on our toes here. You never know when Sam's going to pull you in.
You're going to have to announce the transition from the highbrow academic part of the evening into the bingo hall moment, which is probably when you bring me out. I don't know. I'm up here.
There's nothing wrong with the bingo hall. I mean, you know, Aeneas MacDonald, so-called, would have despised the bingo hall, but he despised popular culture. He was of that style of, you know, like the Hugh McDermidds, who despised the common man. And it's the most hateful sort of view to have of the world, as far as I'm concerned. It really is.
Well, of course, he published Hugh McDermott You know, he was a good chum of Dr. Grieve, Hugh McDermott, and it was a pretty unhealthy sort of setup, actually. The Scottish nationalist cause, the Home Rule cause. Yeah.
So let's go on to the bingo hall.
Well, I think someone got very close to putting £10 in the swear jar there. So.
Now, Sam, do you want how much time have I got? Do you want me to go on and read from the other book, or should we let somebody else have a shot?
Charlie, we have as long as we want, really. I know everyone very kindly said, hey, I'm yours for as long as you want in the evening, especially in this time zone. We have Freddie Johnson from Buffalo Trace struggling to get connected. My colleague's trying to fix it right now, so I'm on my phone a bit trying to solve that. I'd love him to speak next because he's got a time commitment in about 30 minutes. But in the meantime, please, let's continue this line of conversation. And if you
I'll read only one paragraph from this. I recommended this recently to Dr. Morgan. It's called The Chattering Worm. It's a very obscure book, published in 1983 by Canongate, Nick's own publisher. Its subtitle is A Vivisection of Post-Calvinist Scotland, Entrails Minutely Scrutinized, Confessions of a Justified Sinner of Our Time, Deeply Pessimistic and Scottish, which I love. The author, a man called J.P. McConduch, was a teacher in Paisley. He was born and bred in Paisley, and I think he finished as the principal, the dominie of Paisley Academy. But he wrote this deeply depressing book. But it has this lovely passage, which I'll read part of, when he's discussing whiskey with a young guy. It's a powerful solace for a man, the whiskey, said MacAndrew. MacAndrew is his character. He's a minister. He's a darn miserable minister. Indeed, it is a creature of infinite capacity. There's nothing it cannot do. It warms the blood against the chittering wind and refreshes you exhausted in the heat. It can make you ill, and yet it is a sovereign medicine in sickness. It can exalt, so that a man sits with the so-called immortals, careless of his kind, master for a time of his servile destiny. It can depress and humble him to crawl in the excrement of his own miserable bowels of self-compassion. It can sharpen a man's awareness of the world outside him and of the specious prospects within him. And it can dull his senses and his wits, equating him with the wormy clod he is in fact. Without doubt, it is an unpredictable, multi-consequential intoxicant, imbuing its partakers with manifold desires and proclivities, some to sleep and some to bestir themselves, some to preach and some to blaspheme their imagined creator, some to meditate and some to fornicate, much abused by its addict and its traducers alike. It is a complicated simple, the whiskey, pure in essence, but diverse in effects, and against it none can prevail. Don't you love it?
That's brilliant, Charlie. It really is.
You're brilliant, Charlie. Thank you. The reading as well, the personality. I miss you so much. Lovely that you could join us tonight.
Yeah.
Remember sitting in company of one another? Do you remember that? Feels like a long time ago.
It does.
Sam, you probably don't know this, but very often when I'm with Charlie, I have the responsibility of singing him to sleep. When we go sailing, it's my job. The last thing at night is to sing him a lullaby to get him off to sleep. And I have to miss that, Charlie.
You just have to put Joni Mitchell on. That's the idea.
Or Joni Mitchell, yeah, or Joni Mitchell.
I was just going to say, Charlie, I have my copy of the channel.
Oh my God, you're the only person I've ever met who's got a copy.
But the only reason I got it was because you recommended it to me. And I'm just looking at this back in the 1980s. But it said, what I've written in here is deeply pessimistic and Scottish, which I think was your recommendation at the time. So it has been a constant companion I think probably the only 2 copies of it.
I
Ever bought.
I have to admit that I've never managed to get through the whole book. It's a very depressing book.
This is profoundly depressing, but it's a fantastic writing.
Yeah.
So thank you as ever, Charlie. Thank you.
God bless.
Well, speaking of depressing, Freddie, I think we've had some trouble with the time zone. Probably my fault that we fell back here 2 weekends ago. I think they just changed their clocks this weekend. I think Freddie's able to join us now. I'm going to bring him in a few minutes. I wanted to just set it up with a little video for a little background for those who don't know Freddie. I've been lucky enough to spend some time with him, listening to his stories, being taken around the distillery at Buffalo Trace with him. I think some people on this call are the same. They've specifically requested to make sure they have a chance to chat with him while we're here, but I'm delighted. I think he's finally connected. We're going to give it a go. But in the meantime, let's just take a little cooler, top up your glass, have some more toddy, look after yourself, look after your family, and we'll see you in a second.
Just as the movement of whiskey is a vital process in the aging process, so is the passing of the torch at Buffalo Trace among family members from one generation to the next. One such employee, whose family history is inextricably blended with the storied history of the distillery, is Freddie Johnson. A third-generation employee of Buffalo Trace, Johnson's introduction to bourbon began with his grandfather, a 52-year employee under Colonel Blanton, and extended to his father, who had a 47-year run with the late Elmer T. Lee.
I currently get a chance to work with members of the distillery that their fathers worked with my dad, and their grandfather worked with my grandfather.
Today, Johnson is one of the most popular tour guides at Buffalo Trace, sharing his expansive personal and institutional knowledge with tourists from around the globe.
There's some bourbon that's getting ready to get released, and I'm looking for some of it. It'll be some of the last barrels of bourbon that Elmer and my dad got a chance to handle at this distillery.
Oh. Such a character. I think he's joining us. Let's hope. Otherwise, we'll get Matt. And Matt's a pretty decent storyteller too.
So Freddie is doing what he does best and finishing up a tour right now. Apologize that I didn't think through the time change and how that may impact the schedule for the day. But you're not here to hear or see me. So Freddie will be here momentarily. He's excited to share a couple sips with you, and this actually works out better for his schedule. He could stay on longer with you guys now. Again, our apologies on the timing mishap.
No, it might have been the communication in my second email too, because I might not have changed it from the week before. Of course, you remember because you hadn't changed. Nonetheless, here we are. Let's distract each other from all the activity there. Oh, there's 10 pounds. I'd love to pour you a hot toddy, Matt. Thanks a lot for organizing this. We'll bring Freddie in when we see him in the corner. Okay.
Perfect. He'll be here momentarily.
Brilliant. See you soon. Nonetheless, I've done the setup video. I don't know what I'm going to do next time. I'll try to find something else. I think I've got photos of myself at Buffalo Trace. For some reason, some of the photos I'm wearing a certain outfit, and other photos I'm wearing a totally different one. So I think they're on the same day. So I cannot think for life of me the excuse. Gemma, were you there with me?
No, unfortunately not. I've been with Whiskey Wingo. But
yeah, so I was. Andy, were we there together?
I'm really struggling to. I was there, and I was lucky enough to have a tour with Freddie, which, as you just said, is one of the most memorable experiences you can have. I'm fairly certain you weren't there.
Piper making an appearance in the background there. Hey,
Oh,
Pipe.
yeah. There's the dog. I tried to make it dark in here, Sam, but it's 3 o'clock in the afternoon, almost 4 o'clock in the afternoon here, so I couldn't
Looks
really,
like a glorious day.
really bring a fireside chat a la Scotland to life here. I apologise.
I think we're taking care of that. Look behind Gemma. Look behind me.
I know, it's beautiful. I have to tell you, it's making me very homesick. I'm getting very homesick today. And I sit here...
When was the last time you were home, Andy?
August, briefly. But I sit here with books on the bookshelf that are written by the people that are speaking, and I feel extraordinarily humbled to be here and to be part of this. I'm a huge fan of all the speakers, so I hope I don't let them down.
So you're homesick, Andy. Tell we all worked together at Balvenie. I don't think we all crossed over at the same time, did we?
Maybe very briefly.
Yes.
I think briefly we did.
You both interviewed me.
See?
That's right. One of the most impressive interviews I think I've ever been involved in. And I think
The
Sam
most terrifying interview I've ever been involved in. What a
think
lot of
Sam
pressure
very
going
intimidating
from
guy.
being a tour guide being a tour guide at the distillery in Scotland, and then being all of a sudden flown to New York to sit and interview in front of a panel of people. Both of you part of that panel. I was terrified.
Well, didn't Sam and I both say that day, I'm really happy I wasn't interviewing today for the same job, because I would never in a million years have got it.
Absolutely. Well, and do you know that when I started, I was the first ambassador in the US, and they quickly realized they mishired, and they hired you 6 months later.
No, not at all. I'd have been nowhere without you. This is turning into a love fest.
Well,
I
I
should
love
get the
you.
rest of the Balvenie team on here.
We could do a whole one with them next Thursday. It's, look, I miss all of you. And I'm so glad that whiskey friends that I was able to reach out to were able to join tonight, because I would love to see you in person. It's been a very hard 9 months for everyone watching, for all of us. And it reminds us to make that extra effort whenever we can to make that connection. As superficial and strange as it feels through these virtual means, it still counts and it hits me. So it's lovely seeing you.
Here.
Yeah,
Love
likewise.
fest over. Okay, so it's not too early for a drink. That's good to know, Andy, unless that's apple juice.
No, it's not too early. No, I'm not going to go there.
Why don't we move to a story with you? I know you moved to the States with Visit Scotland, was it initially, or?
Yeah. I worked for the tourist board when I first came here, and I this isn't necessarily a whiskey story, but I suppose whiskey, I have a lot to thank whiskey for. I came to the US, I think I was 24, and I literally knew no one in this country. I knew not a living soul. I came here with 3 suitcases. I stayed in the YMCA in Central Park West for 4 days while I figured out where to live. And I have kind of an interesting immigrant story. I have a very unconventional path here. I'm not going to claim that I have the difficult immigrant story, but I think about some of the highlights of the time since I've been here, and I think about those early days. And America's, it might be a common language, but it's not necessarily a common culture. And so it takes you a while to assimilate. I remember going into a deli. If anyone's ever been in a New York deli to order a sandwich, something so simple as ordering a sandwich is like being put on the stage at Carnegie Hall and being told to sing. You stand in this queue for 15 minutes and there's 1,000 people waiting to order their sandwich, and you kind of shuffle forward in the queue and you get to the front and the guy's like, hey, what do you want? You're like, it's a sandwich. What do you want? What do you want on the sandwich? Ham? I'll have, what kind of ham? I don't know, chopped ham?
Yeah, but in New York, 7 people behind you are going, come on, buddy, what are you doing over here?
Well, and he goes, "What? You want cheese? Yeah, I'll have cheese. What kind of cheese? You want American? You want provolone? You want Swiss? I don't know, cheese. Just give me cheese." And then what else do you want? You want lettuce, tomato? And you're like, whoa. And the guy behind you strolls in and goes, "Let me have a ham and tomato and rye, easy on the mayo, okay, lightly toasted." And he just goes away with his thing. And I'm still standing there going, "I don't know if I want salt and pepper." So it's certainly an intimidating place to move to. But I've been here almost 16 years, and I think I still feel a bit like a fish out of water, you know. And even though I've definitely done my best to assimilate, my children are American, my wife's American, I'm still a bit of a fish out of water. And I brought my family along for the ride. You know, I brought my Scottish family. They come over and we all kind of go through it together. I got married in New York, just outside New York, the Hudson Valley. And it was like, talk about the fusion of two cultures. You know, my mother, who sadly passed away this year, drink to her, she was a real character, my mother. You know, she came out, brought a whole load of her friends out for the wedding, and she told all her friends that it was a free bar. So they're all like, you know, go. You know, we're staying at a hotel for the whole weekend, and she told them all, hey, don't worry, it's a free bar. And so I arrive at the venue on the Friday, and the owner of the hotel is running across the car park, running across the parking lot, waving me down, saying, I need to talk to you. I need to talk to you. And I said, what's the problem? I said, it's your family. They're stealing alcohol from behind the bar. So they had taken free bar as they arrived at the hotel and went behind the bar and started making themselves drinks. So they didn't realise it was a free bar, as in there would be a bartender there serving you a drink.
Yeah,
so
the whole free bar was different.
The whole thing was almost over very quickly. But yeah, just some crazy stories. I actually have a quick Sean Connery story since this. You know, this is somewhat biographical, which is really embarrassing given that we're hearing about Alexander Walker and all these greats of Scotch whisky. But you know, I have these really remarkable moments in my 16 years in America. And one of them, given that we just lost the great Sean Connery, I was asked, I think about 12 years ago, maybe 13 years ago, to speak, to address the haggis at a burn supper that Sean Connery was throwing in New York. And it was a private dinner party. And, you know, if you met somebody like Sean Connery, James Bond in Scotland, there would be 100 people there and you wouldn't be able to get near to him. As it happened, I ended up, you know, arriving maybe 20 minutes before I was supposed to arrive. And I was happy to stand outside, but I was invited in. And I was invited into this big room. And in the room were me, Sean Connery, and Nicola Benedetti, the great violinist. And, you know, I was certainly a third wheel. I would have been very happy to polish glasses or do anything other than pretend that I belonged in that conversation. And so anyway, I was I just kind of felt the only, you know, the well-mannered thing to do was to kind of go over and pretend I could partake in the conversation. But Sean Connery was being very kind of charming with Nicola. Oh, look at your show. But you're so good at what you do. But look at your neck. It's all bruised. Your neck's all bruised. It's just because of the violin. So they were having this conversation. I was like a total third wheel. And this is a true story. He goes into his pocket and he starts tapping his pocket like this. And he pulled out, it's a true story, he pulled out a Tummocks caramel wafer. I have no idea where he got that from, but he had a Tummocks caramel wafer in his top
been on a Logan Air flight.
Like someone had just handed it to him on the way in, you know, which would be a very strange thing to do. And he pulls it out of his pocket and he says, "Here, Sean, you have that. I thought it was a shell phone, but you have that." I was literally sent away to go and eat this Tummocks caramel wafer so that he could talk to Nicola Benedetti. So that's my brush with James Bond at a New York dinner party. And, you know, we've lost a great Scotsman this week.
Yeah, that's true. So true. I've got a Sean Connery story as well, just flare on them as well. So when long time since I've seen you, Andrew. So nice to see you again. So like I came back into the office. I was out in the plant one day, and I came back into the office, and Caroline, the kind of the admin, the kind of really the person who runs Laphroaig, stand at the door. "Oh, John, come in. I've just had Sean Connery on the phone. You have to phone him back." And I'm like, nah, because like I would probably go. I would say I would be more skeptical than gullible. Okay, so that's the typical kind of Scottish skepticism kicking in, going, Yeah, Sean Connery. So like, looked at the number. It's still in the drawer on this desk. Actually, I've still got it. I was kind of looking at that, just kind of reminiscing as he passed last weekend as well. And I was just thinking like, oh wow. But looked at the number, looked at the code. Yeah, Bahamas. That sounds okay. Looked at that, right? Okay, maybe they're not taking the mickey. So I phoned the number, hanging onto the phone. The phone's ringing and ringing and ringing, and this lady answers the phone, and she went, "Hi, who is it?" And I went, "My name's John Campbell. I'm at Laphroaig Distillery in Islay. I've been told to ring this number. It's Sean Connery." And she went, "Oh, hold on, I'll just pass over the phone." So that's the wife I'm speaking to. And then he comes onto the phone, and he was a wee bit kind of croaky. I don't know why, but and then he came onto the phone, and he kind of went, "Oh, okay," and it was in a voice, and it was just talking away, and I didn't think it was Sean Connery. I was convinced this isn't Sean Connery, and so starts talking away. "Oh, I've just been at an event in New York, and I've been offered a Laphroaig cask." And so now I'm thinking, right, this guy is just at it. And of course I went, "Oh, okay, well, I guess I'll just, I'll have to find out about that and I'll phone you back." So I hung up on Sean Connery. And so I guess it's a wee bit of a claim to fame, but like, not what you want, I guess. And so when I phoned him, like, I obviously kind of thought, shit, I wonder if that is real. And then the kind of recognition, I've just hung up on Sean Connery, kind of kicked in, and it was just like, oh no, man, right, okay, I'm gonna have to do a wee bit of kind of scrambling here, because what happens if the folks in Chicago find out? I'm fired. I'm just doomed if they find out about this. So kind of like trying to find out, emailing everyone in the US, phoning everyone I knew in my contact book, like, what's going on? What's going on? How did Sean Connery phone Laphroaig? And what's this event in New York? So like nothing. So I had to just basically, I thought, oh, well, bugger it. I'm just going to phone. If I get sacked, I get sacked. I'm just going to phone him back anyway, just for a wee double take. So phoned him up, and I had one of the kind of nicest conversations, just normal, nice conversations with him again. And it was just amazing. He was just so like lovely about the whole me groveling back at him and everything. So I guess, yeah, I've hung up the phone and Sean Connery. He was good. Yep.
Great story.
Thanks for that, both of you. All right, that was an impromptu one, Don. I hope to bring you in again later. I see that Freddie's at his desk.
Okay.
And you told us about family, and again, kudos to your mom. I met her, lovely woman who just exuded warmth to strangers and friends and family alike. Just such a bundle of joy. Really a lovely lady. And
cheers.
Again, yeah. But family, right? Family is something I miss massively. Of course, I've lived abroad since 2002. You've lived abroad how long?
Coming up 16 years here in the US.
Well, my brother was just in the hospital. We've had this, I won't say the L word, we've had strange situation where we can't see our family, and there's all these things we took for granted. And it's suddenly weighing on me. And I think, I'm not sure if Freddie has a similar story, but I know that with all the famous names at the Buffalo Trace Distillery, his is going down in history as well, with with all the other famous names at Buffalo Trace. Freddie,
how you doing?
Good. I'm so glad you could join us. Thank you. Oh, and you've always got a bottle of water. Good to see you.
Oh, well, I don't think I can top the James Bond story. So Sean Connery's kind of pretty cool.
Your story is a bit about family guilt, and me and Andy definitely get the family guilt. I know. I'd love you to tell that, because we have, E.H. Taylor, Elmer T. Lee, W.L. Weller, Pappy Van Winkle, Blanton, of course, a special connection to your family.
Yes.
But I want to hear about Freddie Johnson. Can you tell us how you came to be a Buffalo Trace, Freddie?
Believe it or not, I actually started playing here when I was a kid, 5 years old. I was fascinated not with the whiskey part. I'd been around whiskey all of my life. But on my grandfather's side, on my mom's side, I'm from the mountains of Kentucky. So I played up in the mountains. My grandfather mined his own coal, and his buddies ran moonshine stills out of the coal mine. And that was because of the black coal dust covered up the mold that would get on the trees and the buildings that made it easier for the revenuers to find them. So I learned about the illegal way of making whiskey. And then when I would, in my home here in Frankfurt, my grandfather and my dad were right here at Buffalo Trace. So I learned the legal way of making it. And the most fascinating thing for me about how all this happened was I got to see the distillery and the process from a kid's point of view. So my background was engineering, chemistry, and science. And so over the years, I basically got involved in projects. I did a lot of things. I received national recognition from, believe it or not, it's from the 4-H Club. So if you've ever heard about the 4-H Club, there was a competition, and I made a project. And it won locally, then it won regionally, then it won the division, and then it won national. And I got to go to Washington, D.C., and I got to see the Smithsonian Institute. I got a chance to go to New York and see live theater performances. And for a little old country bumpkin, that was fascinating. And what it did was it made me think outside of the box. And so even today, because of that, I do a lot of tours for kids in middle school and high school. And I don't even talk about whiskey. Whiskey is known as a product. But I talk to them about structural engineering. I talk to them about chemistry. I talk to them about agriculture and the grains. I talk about being an arborist and understanding trees and forestry and the sustainability of Mother Nature and why it's important to take care of our surroundings. And but I do it from the way that a kid would approach making whiskey. And because of that, more and more families and more visitors started to come to Buffalo Trace. And we would do basically behind the scenes tour, and it was a touchy-feely tour. And
pardon me, Freddie, I brought John in because, John, you must have grown up near distilleries.
Yeah. No, I used to play football in basically the front garden at Laphroaig, not knowing what was going on behind me. I was just interested in football. Yeah.
And so you get a chance to see all this stuff, and you don't think of it. You don't think of it as a job. That's what's fascinating about this whole thing, because you get so involved in it, it just makes sense. And you do certain things, and others are fascinated with how things work. But for you, it's like, yeah, that's the way things are supposed to work. And it's contagious. It's all I can say. It's contagious. So I get out of school, and the assumption with my father and my grandfather here at Buffalo Trace Distillery, back then it was known as Stagg Distillery, George T. Stagg, and it was known as Shenley Corporation, ancient age. I get out of school, the bourbon industry has gone flat. So if you think about the 60s to the 90s, bourbon was no big deal. So my father was disappointed that there was no job available, but he was happy that I found a job. I think he was thinking I was going to end up staying at home and eating all of his food, and but anyway, so he was finally happy he could kick me out of the nest. And he had me make a promise. I never understood the significance of the promise until many years later, but he said, well, I tell you what, I'm happy that you found a job, but would you make me a promise? And the promise is simply this: if you ever get a chance in your lifetime to work at the distillery while I'm still alive, would you do that for me? And I'm like, sure, Dad. And I said, well, what's up? And he says, well, I would like to personally be able to tell people that we had 3 direct generations to work at Buffalo Trace Distillery. I would like to tell them that. And I said, sure, Dad, no big deal. That's an easy one to do. Well, it's like when you go fishing and you throw that bait out in the water and you start getting a couple of nibbles, so you know that the fish is on the line. So then he sets the hook with this one. He says, oh, and by the way, he said, would you be my caregiver since you're coming back? Would you be my caregiver? Sure, Dad, I'll take care of you. Now he's set the hook and he's reeling me in. And I'm thinking, well, this is no big deal. All I have to do is, no matter where I'm living, I can just pack him up and bring him with me wherever I'm going. And he says, and there's one other stipulation. And I'm like, well, what's that, Dad? He said, I want to continue to go to the church that I've gone to all of my life. And when he said that, I was like, okay. So in a very nice way, the way that parents do you sometimes, he was really saying, when I call you, I'm really going to be asking you to come home. And he said, would you do that for me? And I'm like, sure, Dad, sure, I'll do that. Now, the interesting part is I had made a commitment. I had made a promise that I didn't even understand the magnitude of my own promise.
Freddie,
and what actually happened?
You learned, because it wasn't a great time for bourbon, so it wasn't a safe job. You were working in other industries, but you learned, didn't you, then, that you had a natural knack for storytelling, for bringing stories to life?
It was kind of crazy. Yeah. So gosh, it's crazy. Okay. So what happened was I go to work for AT&T. If you know about AT&T in the past before divestiture, there was one little problem. The problem was this: they were so slow in doing things that by the time a customer had something that they wanted, by the time the engineers got through with it and all the funding got arranged and all the other things took place, the need for that had moved on. And so now you're rolling out something that costs millions of dollars that the application no longer was effective. And what had happened was, years ago, I had this crazy knack of taking engineering specs and parameters and saying engineering things in ways that the capital finance folks, the customers and the clients and the marketing folks could understand what the engineers were asking the money for. And I was like an interpreter. And I would sit down with groups like Delta Airlines and some of the other reservations companies, and they would talk about designs and things that it would be nice that the telephone did these things. And I would then translate those into engineering terms for the engineers so that they would actually build what the customer wanted. So what we were able to do is we were able to reduce the amount of time that it took to do a capital project from roughly 2.5 years. We were able to do it in 6 months. We won national recognition, but that design is in place today. You use it today. It's called the STAR network, and it allows you to call an airline and make a plane reservation, and then a prompt comes on and says, well, since you're flying to New York, do you need a hotel? And all you have to do is just hit a little prompt, and it says, okay, here's a bunch of hotels, which one you want to go to? Go to that one. You make your hotel reservation. Oh, will you need a car while you're there? Well, yeah. You hit another prompt. It puts you into the rental car rental agencies. Oh, you want to eat out with some guests? Where would you like to eat? Oh, we'll just hit that prompt and we'll bring you up onto a bunch of. So we created this, and in the midst of that, that's when Dad called. So this skill set was with me all along. I had just never thought about its applications in other industries. So I just tell people all the time, life is a journey. And unfortunately, we get caught up in our careers and we start to become very specialized. And without realizing it, we have all these other skill sets waiting inside of our brains to be explored, and we never give them a chance. So I was blessed enough to be able to, because of this promise to my dad, I was able to step out of that environment, come back to my home environment, and all of a sudden I discovered the same skill sets that are engineering parameters applied to making whiskey. And it's crazy. Now, the kicker, and I'm going to stop. The kicker is this. This story has a really interesting twist. So I'm out on the farm here with my dad, and a driver comes by and he hollers out the window and he says, "Hey, Freddie." He said, "Man, it's really crazy up in New York right now, isn't it?" I said, "I beg your pardon?" He said, "You don't know what's going on in New York?" I said, "No." He said, "You and your dad need to go inside and turn on the TV." So we go inside, we turn on the TV, and it's the plane flying into the World Trade Center. My dad looks at me. I look at my dad. My dad comes over and hugs me. And he says, "I love you, son." The significance of that, my commute in from New Jersey, I hooked up in Hoboken. It's called the Path. Takes you underneath the Hudson River, but the termination is the base of the World Trade Center. And that's where you get on the subway, where I would get on the subway to go down to 6th Avenue. And the significance of that moment was that my commute would have put me underneath the World Trade Center when the planes hit the building. So because of a promise that I made to my father years ago, I'm alive today. So I came back to take care of him, but in the process, he saved my own life. So I just believe that there's a power greater than us that keeps us up, keeps us around, because just like what you're doing today, we touch lives every day. And I'm going to end it with this as we talk about these products. The product in the bottle, I mean, it doesn't matter whether it's a wine or a whiskey or a good bourbon. The product in the bottle will only, a good bottle, I'm going to say a good bottle, you will only bring it out with people you care about. If I don't care about you, I won't even tell you. If I don't like you, I won't even tell you I've got it because I don't want you to have any of it. It's special. The other unspoken rule, no matter how much I like you, if we're in a hurry to go do something else, you ever notice it's not the right time to bring it out? You only bring out your good stuff when you're about to sit down and spend some time with someone you truly enjoy being with. And all of a sudden you realize that the liquid in this bottle, it doesn't matter whether it's a Scotch or an Irish whiskey or a bourbon. The product in this bottle is nothing more than a conduit. It is something that allows you to spend time with someone that you truly enjoy being with. I find it amazing. So here we are.
I think
and you're touching lives right now. Okay. So I'm honored to be a part of this. I had no earthly idea that this little country bumpkin would be talking to the likes. When I saw this list of folks that you had assembled, I'm like, what do I have to offer to the likes of this group? I mean, geez, I'm like the little kid over in the side. Like, this is like me. I'll give you, I got to stop you. Y'all got me pumped up here for some reason. But when I first came back to take care of my dad, I've been here with 3 different living master distillers. So Elmer T. Lee, his wife made me cookies when I was a kid. So I was here with Elmer, followed by Gary Gayhart, and currently Harlan Wheatley, who is our master distiller today. And when I would get together in these groups, I got a chance to go to these different sessions with Jimmy Russell and Booker Noe and Parker Beam and Lincoln Henderson. Most people don't even know Lincoln Henderson. They know Angel's Envy. They know Wes Henderson. But Lincoln Henderson was just as quiet and easygoing, like Jimmy Russell and Elmer and all these old guys, Parker B. They were not pretentious. They were very quiet, just good whiskey makers. And what I learned from them was this: when you're in a room of folks like that, it is the most exciting thing just to be quiet and listen. And you learn so much in just a short period of time. And my walk away that still haunts me today is they started talking about making good whiskey. And this fellow by the name of Ronnie Edens made the comment. He said, you know something, folks? If you're in this business and you're a good whiskey maker, and you come here in your early 20s, and with everything you've learned about whiskey making and everything you've learned from your family and friends, you start to work on your whiskey. He said, and you tinker with it, and you play with fermentation, and you play with different yeast, and you do all this stuff, and you stumble upon something that when it comes off the still, you think this is pretty darn good. So you make some of it and you put it in a barrel. He said, then you have to determine how long does it need to sit in that barrel to produce the flavors that I think are so unique and special that I'm willing to put my name on that bottle. He says, and all of a sudden you realize, even if it's a 10 to a 15-year-old product, maybe a 20-year-old product, from the time you started to that point that you release it to your consumer, he said, you're now 45 years old. And that was your first good batch of whiskey. He said, so you make another batch. And with everything that you've learned, you put it into the barrel. And by the time it reached the consumer, he said, you're 70 to 75 years old. And you've only made 2 batches of good whiskey. So he said, in this industry, that's why when I think about Scottish and Irish whiskeys, I'm always so fascinated with it, because in this environment, it is very rare that any of these folks that we have come to worship ever even got to taste their third batch to its final maturity. It was a legacy. It was a springboard that they provided to us that says, I got us this far, you take it to the next level. Make me proud. Do something with what I've done. Make it better. And so that's why I'm excited about being at Buffalo Trace. We have over 30,000 experimental barrels of whiskey on premise right now. Those are the whiskeys that I will never live to taste, but I have been a part of them being made. And they're the whiskeys for 2040, 2050, 2060, 2070. And they're in the barrels right now. But they're an experiment. How crazy. So that's why I'm going to sit back and listen to you guys. You know, the Sean Connery stuff is cool, but I started looking at this portfolio of folks that are assembled here, and I think the world of what you do and what you write about. I feel so honored. I will share this with you. I went over to the lab and I sat down with Broom, who is our whiskey blender, our master blender here at Buffalo Trace. And I said, I want you to walk me through a tasting comparison with some of the more noted scotches like Islay and all of these. I said, I want to compare those to things like George T. Stagg and Eagle Rare. I said, I don't want someone to tell me about these. I said, I want to experience these, and I would like for you to just take a moment and walk me through this. So I spent a good part of this afternoon, out of respect for each of you, trying to see what are the similarities or what are the things that if I was trying to transition from Scotch to bourbon, what would I do or how would I approach it so that you would be just as excited about the bourbon as I've gotten to be about the scotches that I tasted this afternoon. So that's my story, and I'm sticking to it.
Thank you so much, Freddie. I mean, I know, John, do you have your denouement piece? Do you have your cask waiting that you're going to modestly pass on? Because that is such a romantic thing in whiskeys, and the modesty it takes to lay down things you may never see come to fruition.
Yeah, no, I think that's just, it's what you're told. Basically, it's your job to keep things going, maybe improve things, but not too much, keep it the same, mainly. But you're just there holding the torch for the next girl or guy that comes along. So that's your job. And you're given the kind of, this is what it is, this is what you do, and this is what you don't do type stuff. And that is definitely part of the induction. And I think it's ingrained in everyone that works in the distillery. It's just, everyone understands the role in preserving the past as well as the future, definitely.
Well, I wondered that confluence of things, the past and the future. Gemma, if we could come to you with Balvenie stories. I know one of the stories, you shared a video with me, you sent me a bottle, you brought it, I think Olwen brought it over. Delicious whiskey, of course, but something that someone laid down who did get to see it come to fruition. So let me just go to the video and then you can come back and tell us about it.
Yep, I'd love to.
Thanks. Cheers again, Freddie. Look, mate, if you need to take off, please feel free. It's been so nice seeing you. I can't wait to see you in person again.
Thank you. I just want to say a little bit of this. I'll tell you what, I mean, I am like the little kid in the candy shop right now, listening to you share stories and stuff. So I'll just be here in the background, and I just have a closing thought after a while, but I just want to enjoy listening to you and some of the stories, and just like the good whiskey she's about to talk about. So
amen. Friends sitting around. Amen, Freddie. Thank you.
It must be quite surprising now to actually see these whiskies from these trials that you had been so involved in.
Time moves on, and then 15, 20 years later, it all catches up with you. It's nice to be at the beginning and at the end.
Yes, that early sentiment, right? You want it to go longer, it can go longer, but it's beautiful.
Yeah, I mean, I have been so fortunate, as have you, to work quite closely with a lot of our craftspeople at Balvenie and tell their stories. You know, people kind of like Freddie, like John. It's so, and they have such incredibly inspiring stories. So it's been quite a journey working on the Balvenie Stories range, which you started a couple of years ago, Sam, and I kind of have taken that mantle from you and been on quite a journey, kind of interviewing the team up at the distillery. We've made a couple of podcasts, which has been interesting, creating these podcasts with some of the folks who've worked at Balvenie for like 30, 40, 50, 60, 58 years in the case of Maltmaster David.
But you know what it's like spending time with these guys, and women. It's one story after another, and we, as ambassadors, we try to scoop them up and sponge them and retell them, but it's just never the same. So what was the genesis?
It is so interesting because, I mean, for example, absolute legend of a storyteller and raconteur, Mashman Brian Webster, who's just over 50 years at the distillery. He, when we were one of the stories whiskies, we found the actual mashing record. So the Day of Dark Barley, which is produced from a batch of roasted malt, we found the mashing records going back to 1992, hand signed by Brian. So this is exactly in black and white what we had. Go to Brian and say, hey, Brian, do you remember this day? Do you remember this batch of whiskey? What happened here? And Brian, I've heard Brian tell that story, and I've heard him tell that story like 5 different ways and bring in it. So it's like, this is the beautiful thing about storytelling. Like when you are telling stories, what is fact, what is fiction, like you're bringing in color, like you're relying on your memory and what you how you remember things, how you can recall things. So what I've really found fascinating about the Balvenie stories and kind of working with some of the craftsmen there, it's how the stories evolve and change, and also discovering some of the incredible stories that they have to tell and like their own. So we didn't kind of get to it on that little film, but that whiskey, the one that you have in your hand right now, the barley was malted by a man called Robbie Gormley. And Robbie, he worked for about he retired 2 years ago. He spent 47 years working at the distillery, 20 of them working in warehousing, and then moved over to work in the maltings. And he has such an incredible legacy because pretty much everyone coming to work at the distillery would start in the maltings and then go out and work in other parts of the distillery. So Robbie kind of broke them in, so to speak, in the beginning. They would have to do their stint with Robbie before they then went on to another part of the distillery. So for example, I'm going to just digress quickly and tell you a great story that Humpy, who is one of the stillmen up at Glenfiddich, George Garrick, when Robbie retired, he said to Robbie, "I've got a present for you." And at Robbie's retirement party, Humpy presented him with a frame. And inside that frame was a note that said, "Humpy, I've effed up. You're going to have to squidgy the floor. P.S. Burn this after reading."
Yeah.
Now, Humpy held on to this note for 17 years. 17 years previously, Robbie had forgotten to turn off the tap, filling the steep in the maltings, and it had overflowed, and he left Humpy this note and he presented it to Robbie when he retired.
I remember I handed it over to him. He had kept that. That's just hilarious. And the little poem that he read as well, the stories. I mean, Robbie.
So I can genuinely, like, Robbie is such an incredible storyteller. He is a songwriter. He's a poet. Last summer, we threw, when we released the first batch of the stories range, we threw a party at the Highlander Inn for all the craftsmen, invited them down, had lunch and drams. And Robbie was so excited that he had Portwood on tap from behind the bar from Tatsuya. And then Dennis McBain, coppersmith, who absolute legend, joined us back in 1958 and has spent 62 years involved with the distillery. Dennis and I were the drivers. So we're at the end of the day, at the end of the party, we drove everyone back home, and I had Robbie in the car, and Robbie was like so full of the joys of life. He started singing, and he sang a song that he wrote called the Cleric Song. And it's written to the lyrics of a song by Hank Snow, It Don't Hurt Anymore. Sorry, the tune. He rewrote the lyrics to the tune of Hank Snow, It Don't Hurt Anymore. I'm not going to sing it for you. I could, but you can go and listen to our podcast if you want to hear my terrible rendition of that song. But something I do want to tell you is the poem that Robbie wrote for his retirement party.
Yeah.
So Robbie spent all of those years working in the floor maltings at Balvenie. And we kind of have a lot of legends and tales of a ghost at the distillery called the Green Lady. I've heard you've gone running from her at one point in time, Sam, when you were playing your guitar in the maltings. She chased you right out.
Well, it had been a long time fantasy. We recorded a record in the maltings. It was a long time. We had 3 days to do it, and it was a fantasy to play music in this big empty space that's still in operational maltings. How exciting! So the rest of the band left, and I said, "I'm going to stay down. I'm going to stay down here." And I got an opportunity to do it. 3 to 5 seconds in, I stopped playing. Hello? Start playing again. Hello? 15 seconds later, I was packing up, getting the fuck out of there.
So Haunted's incredibly haunted by the Green Lady. So there's like generations of maltmen who've like hand to hand passed down stories of her, hearing her, seeing her out the corner of their eye. Robbie, when he's turning the floor in the kiln upstairs, he'll never turn his back to the door. He always kind of faces the kiln door, and he used to shuffle back and forth. So he spent years being haunted by the Green Lady's shuffling feet. So when he retired, he didn't want to make a speech. He decided he was going to compose a poem, and he read this poem on during his retirement party. So I'm going to recite it for you. It's called My Last Night Shift, and it goes like this. I was working away with the radio on, singing along to a well-kent song, throwing down my very last steep. when I heard the sound of shuffling feet. Coming ben the loft was the Green Lady, and on her shoulder, the elusive malt monkey. Well, she could see that she gave me quite a scare as she slowly came closer and sat down on the stair. And Monkey fickered about and played with her hair. She started to speak in a voice so low, I had to go turn off the radio. Robbie, she said, we've watched over you all these years, throwing down steeps, pulling out flares, teaching others how to use a shield. For a while, there was a quine as well, telling stories about us too, to lots of visitors and even to film crews. Robbie, it's time for us to disappear, but we'll be back another year. As they walked off, Monkey looked back for one last peek, and I carried on, throwing down my steep. It's a night that'll always bide with me, my very last night shift at the Balvenie.
Wonderful. Wonderful.
At that same party I was talking about when I drove Robbie home, they all made me, they were bamming me up saying, oh, Gemma's learned your poem, Robbie, Gemma's learned your poem. And so they made me recite it to him, and I missed out 2 lines, never heard the end of it.
That's good. Oh, beautiful, Gemma. Thank you. Can you quickly summarize the stories then? Because the stories obviously are tied to Liquid. You know, it's not just these stories, but they're all tied to.
So some of them, you know, they're little kind of pieces of history. I mean, I guess similar to like the casks Freddie was referencing and John that you've laid down, they're sort of pieces of history that can never be recreated, basically. Like that, we have as part of the range, there's been the 26-year-old Day of Dark Barley, the roasted malt. So that was 1992. It was a batch of roasted malt that arrived in the pouring rain one day, and the guys, Brian and Robbie, had to carry every single sack, 25 kilos as it came into the courtyard, up the stairs to store it in the malt loft. And like that experience for them is stuck in their memory. It's so powerful because they remember, like they'll describe the raindrops dripping down their back, how miserable they felt, their arms aching, their legs aching at the end of the day. So that was the sort of the Day of Dark Barley, and there was only 100 casks of that filled. It was an experiment, just a trial back then. The next one would be the 19, if we'll kind of work down, the Edge of Burnhead Wood that we talked about, that Robbie malted, and it's a batch that we used heather in the maltings to dry in the kiln. So Dave Stewart, not to be confused with Maltmaster David Stewart, but Dave Stewart, head of estates, who, funny story, when Dave Stewart one day opened up some mail sitting at his desk at the distillery, he now works in the archives at Balvenie, opened up a letter that had arrived to him, inviting him to Holyrood to come down for his MBE from the Queen. And Dave was like, he was sent David Charles Stewart's MBE letter up to the distillery, and it reached Dave's hands first. But Dave Stewart, he went up the hill, cropped all the heather by hand just at the edge of the wood, Burnhead Wood, that you can see looking up the hillside from Balvenie. Handed that over to Robbie, who then malted the stuff, who then used the stuff during malting and the drying. So the 19-year-old, and it's also 100% produced on site, so that's barley grown on the Berry Lees field, which has been farmed for generations longer than we've even had a distillery in Dufton, up the hill and malted by the team as well. Then there's the 14 week of peat, which you saw Ian Miller, who used to be our distillery manager, also of Glenfiddich fame, traveling the world for many years as global ambassador for Glenfiddich. But Ian started off with us, and Ian had experience at managing many distilleries across the country, but ended up with William Grant and Sons through the late 90s, early 2000s. And he was the one that kind of kick-started this whole week of peat that we have at the distillery. So every single year, clear a week schedule and process a peated batch. So there is that story to celebrate him. And then finally, there's a 12-year-old that's finished in Virgin Oak that came from the Kelvin Cooperage over in Kentucky. And if you're familiar with that cooperage, I'm sure, Freddie, I'm sure you've been there and you know the family as well. And
yes,
they're incredible. Kevin and Paul, and really sadly, Kevin passed this year, but they have an amazing story, those two brothers. They came from, their father had a small cooperage on the banks of the River Kelvin in Glasgow in the early 1960s. And then they sort of took the helm in the early 90s and took the cooperage from the banks of the Kelvin over into Louisville, to the heart of Kentucky, to source casks and send them back to Scotland. And they've done some incredible things over the years. And so we sourced some virgin oak barrels from them to finish that whiskey in. And it was our David's apprentice, maltmaster Kelsey McKechnie, who worked closely with them and with the team in our cooperage to create that whiskey. So that's like a summary of the stories. But I think really the most important thing, and it's, you know, like you said, Freddie, that it doesn't really matter what's inside the bottle. At the end of the day, it's sort of the stories that kind of come to create all of the stories that have created that bottle, and then the stories that are going to be shared once that cork's popped and we've thrown it away, Sam, and sit around the fire and share it together. So yeah.
Jim, you made a comment, and I want you to think about this one. This is something that happened to me with my dad. So we had a bottle of Pappy Van Wyck, a 20-year-old, one of the original 20-year-old Pappies, when Julian used to hand label the bottles himself. And he'd given this bottle to our family because my dad had lived long enough to roll out the 6 millionth barrel. He'd rolled out every millionth barrel up until then. Now he's in his early 90s. He's passing away. And Julian gives me this really nice bottle of Pappy. And he says, Freddie, I want you to share this with your father. Sure, I'll do that. So being the wise, wonderful son that I am, I present this bottle to my dad. And I said, oh, Dad, you know, this is some really good Pappy. I said, and he's looking at me and his eyebrow goes up. And he says, I'm very familiar with the product, son. He said, would you just go on and pour me a damn drink? So I do something that we don't even think about. So it's my father, my brother, and I. And I'm pouring the drink. And as I pour the drink, I put the cork back in the bottle. And my father looks at me and he says, what on earth are you doing? I said, Dad, we're doing a toast. He says, I'm fully aware of what we are doing. I'm asking you what you are doing. I said, well, Dad, this is a really good bottle of whiskey. And I said, I'm saving it so that we can do some more toast later on. And my father looked at me and smiled. And he says, don't you ever do that again with friends. He said, your father is 94 years old. He says, Freddie, I don't have a lot of toasting left in me. So he says, when you're with friends, now what do we do with a good bottle of wine when we open it up with friends? You open the bottle, you tell the story, because everyone has a story about a good bottle, and you have to listen to it before you get a drink. So you pour the drink, you pour that glass of wine. But here's the subtlety. What do we do with the bottle? We set the bottle aside and you take the cork and you to let it continue to breathe, right? But what do you do with that really good bottle of scotch or that really good bottle of bourbon that you spent 3 years looking for? You pour that drink, you tell your story, you put the cork back in that bottle and you set it down out of the way. You're one and done with this drink, son. So my father says, never do that. He says, there will always be more whiskey. He said, but never lose sight of why you bring the good bottle out. And he says, the subtle message is when you pour that drink from a good bottle of whiskey, continue to make eye contact with your friends and set the cork to the side of the bottle. That tells them, I'm in no hurry. If you want another drink, here it is. Feel free to have another drink. He said, they will never forget that you did that. He said, it's just like what you alluded to, Jenna. He says, it's far better to have the memories that the bottle creates than to know the memories never got created because you were too busy trying to save the whiskey in the bottle.
Great story.
Yeah.
Freddie,
Here.
I was taught not long after I moved to Glasgow back in the 1980s by a colleague who came from the West Coast. You open a bottle of whiskey and you throw the cork into the fire.
Yep.
That was what I was taught.
Yep.
I remember going first footing as a kid. First footing is a great Scottish tradition that doesn't happen very often anymore. Certainly doesn't happen this year. But as a kid, you got to stay up basically all night at New Year and go around the neighbours' houses. If you saw a light on the road, you could go in. And I remember, I don't think my dad was a whiskey drinker, but it would be an uncle or someone who tried to teach me that you show up with the whiskey in your hand and they open the door. Come away in. You'll have had your tea. It's maybe 3 o'clock in the morning and I'm like a 10-year-old kid. And my uncle taught me, but you make a big deal of the presentation of the whiskey and then you stash it by the door and grab it when you look back out. But the tradition of first footing is a beautiful one because you pass your bottle around and give everybody a dram. We had some great New Year's traditions actually in Scotland, and I think most of them, I don't know, Dave and Charlie and Gemma maybe remember. Most of them seem to be gone now, but John. But yeah, first footing with a bottle of whiskey was it's hopefully going to be a thing that will come back, but not in the age of COVID.
I spent my teenage years growing up in the Isle of Lewis, and first footing, they don't even knock on the door, Andy. They just, up in Lewis, like, people just open your door and steam in, so you never know when or who you're gonna expect.
I remember getting me and my mate. We went first footing in Glasgow and ended up in this flat. We hadn't a clue who the people were because we just barged straight in because it was open house, and we were a wee bit hungry by that point. And we began making some soup. And then the host of the party came in and went, who, what the hell are you doing? We're just making some soup. And we were given the old heave-ho.
But I was brought up in the south end of Ireland, and the tradition was, of course, that you saw the New Year, the bells, in your own house. So we would be down in the pub until, let's say, 1:45, but you had to get back to your house and for the bells. And then you went off, and there was a sort of ritual of the visiting the houses. Well, usually the older folk first, and but there was this wonderful tradition that you'd come in. There was an old woman that we used to visit first called Mary MacDonald, and and she'd go, "Oh, how nice to see you," and good, and you'd sit down, and there was for about 10 minutes, and then it was as if it's like an afterthought. Would you like a dram? And then the first dram came from the house, and then your dram would come out, and then we would go on, and then of course as it went on, the night went on, people would come in. It was the same thing. Will you have a dram? And then you've got to have a dram from there. So the bottles were just whizzing around, and then they would start to sing or narrate poems. Come on, Charlie, give us that song of yours. It was, and as you rightly say, John, it was when the lights were, if the lights were on, then it was then you could go in, and even if you didn't know them, And the tradition, certainly in the south end of Ireland, was that you had to visit all your friends, and they had to visit you. And folk would arrive in our wee house on the 5th of January, and they hadn't slept in their own bed since the bell, and indeed they would get the dram, and then they would just fall asleep, and they maybe sleep for about 4 hours, and then they'd get up, and then they'd give you another dram, and then off they'd go on to the next bit. Oh, those are the days.
So we're going to be similar in Ireland as well.
We're going to launch a campaign, bring back first footing.
The what's it, sorry?
We're going to launch a campaign to bring back first footing.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, absolutely.
But what happens in Islay, John?
We had a guy in Islay who was a professional, and he ended up with a nickname, just like, but it's reminding me there. He was called the Moth, just because of the light on he was in. So it was just hilarious. That just all came flooding back. I mean, you would try and you would try to keep going for days, just as Charlie said. responsible, of course. But it was just he ended up nicknamed the Moth just because he was so professional at seeing the lights on and just getting in. Really amazing. Yeah.
Unless I was storm coming in.
Yeah. And just kind of talking about cultures and accents again. I don't like when you were talking about up at the north there, and your poem there, Gemma, which was fantastic, and a bit of Doric in 2001. I moved.
Yeah, I don't have a good Doric accent, unfortunately, but.
Well, that's neither do I. I'm West Coast right the way through too. So up to Ardmore had been given this task. They were changing from coal-fired stills to steam, and this is way back in 2001. So I'm sent up to Ardmore, and you can help with this project. And this is fantastic! What an amazing project! So working with amazing folk like Robert Hicks, just trying to replicate this spirit. So that was all fantastic. But I remember then. I was after the project. He says, you can just stay and run the place for a wee while. So we'll get you used to dealing with bioplants and all these amazing things. So I remember this was about March time, and so a guy from the West Coast, like it's very rarely goes below 5 Celsius, kind of like 37, 38 degrees, Freddie. So up north, and it was minus 16. First day, which I don't know what that is in Fahrenheit. It's really cold, Freddie. And there was snow on the ground. I had to dig myself out, drive the car to the work, and then kind of dig myself into work. The guy was going up and down the close with the tractor because we were expecting deliveries that day, and then it just kind of struck me. There were these two guys standing in the yard, and they were speaking and shouting at each other, and the only word I got in the conversation was yeast. I just didn't have a clue what they were talking about, and it was just like, it's a completely different culture. I'm so out my depth here with minus 16, snow, and I just don't understand the language. And how do you feel when you went to New York there, Andy?
Well, it's funny. I've had the same problems, and we're Scottish, so when we bring people over to Speyside and to various parts of Scotland, people expect us to translate. And I'll be honest, sometimes in Bamshire, I've struggled to be the translator. And you mentioned Brian Webster earlier, Gemma. Brian is an absolute legend, and we've all got 100 Brian Webster stories. But I was once at the distillery. I think we were filming something, and so I was a wee bit distracted. But there was always a wee bit of competition among the guys, because if you gave somebody a load of spotlight, they would negotiate with their mates. I'll try and get you. I'll try and get you in the next video. Don't worry. And so Brian comes over, drags me into the mash room one day, and says, "I need you to meet Ian. Ian's a great storyteller." So Ian brings me in, and Ian starts telling me this great story, and I'm only, first of all, if I'd been paying full attention, I was still a struggle, but I'm paying maybe 50% attention because I'm quite sure we're breaking some health and safety rules in the turn room. So I'm kind of half there and half out. And so Ian starts telling me this story. I can get up the road and get and so I just needed to make an exit because there was a problem. I said, "That's a great story. That's hilarious." She died in a puddle. And obviously missed the most important part of the story, which was a woman had died in a puddle. And that's a hilarious story. Right, I better go. So, moral of the story: pay attention when people are speaking.
Wow.
Well, if you're paying attention, it's 9:45. Charlie, is it time for bed? Should we take you to bed?
It's a long time since I should have been in bed 15 minutes ago. But please, let's have some more readings or some more stories.
Thank you. Yeah. Okay. Well, let's do that. My friend and co-guitarist and head of Whiskey Outreach. Remember when I lived in New York, Andy? I had an online bout with John Hansel. Do you remember that? There was a bit of back and forth. I had an identity, Dr.Whisky, this blog, and the negativity being spread. And I remember moving back to the UK in the role of Balvenie Global Brand Ambassador and going to the first IWSC Awards dinner in season when I had just come back. And I was getting my coat at the end of the night. I was happy to be back in the UK. I was getting my coat at the end of the night, and I hear behind me, "You fucking showed Hansel," or something along these lines that filled me with such joy. But then I was like, oh shit, who said that? And it was Dr. Nick. So to get an endorsement like that was the great reassurance, and the wind and the sails that started that evening are still behind me. So thanks for that, Dr. Nick. Nick's just come out with A Long Stride, Johnny Walker story, the story of the #1 Scotch whiskey in the world. I'm probably fucked up the title. I apologize, Nick. I should have put it on a screen here. You can tell us how it is. I got 2 copies, incidentally. I got many more coming because I'm giving it to everyone for Christmas. I'll bring it by your house to sign, COVID-free. Oh, 10.
Whoa!
Yeah. Drinks Trust it is. That's fine. Nick, can you tell us a bit about the book? I know I haven't read the whole thing. Dave Broom on the Whiskey Manual wrote a lovely piece around the book a few days ago, picking up on one bit that I also noticed in the first 3 chapters. And again, I'm only a short bit in. But this idea that we all tell stories. That's our job, especially as ambassadors, but as whiskey lovers and as humans. It was really interesting so early in the book to discover so many myths, I get, or at least partial stories that I've been telling for 15 years. Maybe it's our own simplification, or as Dave Broom suggested, it's our own editing of the truth that does this. It's a habit, because we are blenders. Humans, we blend stories. Yes, we blend foods. There's all this study and research into this, but it's this this idea of showing us the other side of the story the way you do so academically and truthfully in the book. I wondered, was there anything that was a big surprise to you, something that you thought you accept as myth or as truth, that in your research, 2 years of research, I think it was, in the book, that surprised you?
3 years of research. Three. Well, I suppose, we talked about it a bit earlier, Sam, but I suppose the toddy thing was one, for example, which, as Dave said as well, then made me think a bit more about why it was that styles of drink changed and the interaction between consumers and the people that made the drink, which was far more evident than I'd realized. So that was one thing. But I think, I suppose the thing that really struck me and got under my skin and into my head more than anything else was the really incredible people that were involved. We know, I'm sure most of the people here have got a copy of the Whiskey Barons on their shelves and stuff like that. And it's all about the more flamboyant people, for the most part, the Tommy Dewars and James Buchanans. And the Walkers were not flamboyant at all. They were very private people in many respects, and they were thrawn, a good Ayrshire word. They were a bit dour, they were a bit hard. They were certainly very obstinate and very stubborn, which was one of the reasons they were so successful ultimately. But behind that, there was a real warmth and humanity, I think, which I was lucky enough to spend months sort of immersed in when I read through letterbooks of correspondence between Alexander Walker, son of John, and his friends, and also his business colleagues, which showed very different sides of the man. Business, he could be as hard as nails, absolutely as hard as nails. With his friends, he was warm, deeply compassionate, very funny, didn't take himself very seriously at all. So it's sort of a really interesting dichotomy there. But I thought I'd read a bit, if I may, which is about Alexander Walker, because he got into my head so much he's going to be there for the rest of my life, sadly. Or maybe not, sadly. And this is a bit about him, as it were, at leisure. Okay, so he had a lovely big house in Kilmarnock in the London Road, which I actually stayed in when I was there working, because part of it was an Airbnb. So I thought that was the right place to stay, just a bit of immersion. And then he also built himself a house in Troon, next to the golf course, as I'll say in a minute. So this is about sort of life at home with Alexander Walker, sort of mid to late 1880s. And it's a story, right? It's a story. The house at Troon also allowed Alexander Walker to indulge in his passion for golf. The golf and shooting I have, he wrote, take up all my spare time. It was literally built next door to the newly established Troon Golf Club, now the Royal Troon Golf Club, of which he was a founder member, jealously guarding the interests of Troon and Kilmarnock members against the much resented incursions of Glaswegians, who he criticised for trying to take over its management. There's some very funny exchanges between him and W.A. Robertson of Robertson and Baxter, who was one of the Glaswegians sort of nosing into the Royal Troon Golf Club. Language was quite strong in that interchange. Crosby Tower, that's the house in Troon, and Pearsland House in Kilmarnock, with a focus for both domestic and business entertainment. For despite his occasional misanthropic outbursts, it's clear from his correspondence that alongside his family, Alexander Walker relished nothing more than good company and companionship and shared food and drink, to the point that Tommy made. It's about sharing the good things, right? Few visitors were discouraged, but sometimes, for all its critical importance in oiling the wheels of the business, the duty of hospitality took a heavy toll. I am beginning to think that my health is of more importance to me than other people's enjoyment, he complained. We have had to do so much entertaining to colonials and cockneys that we hardly knew what it was to have a quiet day ourselves, the consequence being that I am not all the man I should like to be. And I am determined that I shall never attempt to do anything of the kind again. It seems so different entertaining strangers whom you may never see again compared with your real friends. John Blakey, that was Walker's manager in London, aware of the constant stream of visitors to Scotland, people went to Kilmarnock and Troon almost to hold court with Alexander Walker, such was his importance in the industry. Blakey, aware of the constant stream of visitors to Scotland, apologised that the irrepressible Robert McGilligan of R. Marquis McGilligan and Company, important customer, a frequent visitor to the London office of John Walker and Sons in search of sherry and a biscuit, Blakey apologised because he told me he intended to look you up in Scotland, and he is a chap not calculated to forward one's work. On the other hand, a visit from Bernard Lewis, who held the company's New Zealand agency, promised little distraction. I dare say, wrote Alexander, he will be a bit of a bore, but we must get through it as best we can. Family and friends were much preferred. We had a great party last night, about 50, I suppose. They seemed to enjoy themselves well, which was all that was wanted. Kept me a little from sleeping, but that was no matter. With the youngsters here, he wrote to a friend in January 1886, with the youngsters here, all around, it's been parties, parties every night. I expect we shall have the results by and by. And generosity did not only extend to hosting. At Christmas in particular, gifts of wine and whiskey were carefully dispatched to friends and customers. Game from the shoots was sent to London to distribute as judiciously as possible. Kilmarnock cheese was also a very special gift. But for all his love of whiskey and good wines, of local cheese, freshly shot game, pork pies, and even snails and frogs' legs, it was something far more simple that stole his heart, as he wrote to a friend at Christmas in 1888. It occurred to me, he said, it occurred to me that you might still have a Scottish tooth in your head, and I have sent you a small box of Kilmarnock shortbread. I always tell my wife it's one of the shortest roads to heaven that I know of. And that's Alexander Walker at his very best, I think. Just an astonishing person. And I think one of the problems, you know, when you write a book like this is that you sort of fall in love with people, and I certainly fell absolutely in love with Alexander Walker, such a man. And you know, it takes remarkable people to make remarkable brands, and this man was truly remarkable, truly quite exceptional. Have I got time to read another bit, Sam? Oh, Sam's gone.
I don't have a hard stop at 10. We discussed stopping at 10. I'm happy to run. I'm having a lovely time being with you. If anyone needs to drop off, guests or other, please do. But I'm happy to listen more, of course, Nick.
Well, I'll just read one bit because it picks up on that point that we sort of raised earlier about the growth of blended Scotch whiskey. So you know, there are two things in the history of Johnny Walker, right? It's the bicentenary. That's what the company wanted, and they were gracious enough to pay me for 3 years to do that stuff. But it was also, to me, really important to reset the context of the growth of that brand in terms of the story of Scotch, which I see in a rather different way, as you and Dave have both referred to already. And Charlie, I know, shares that view that I see in a slightly different way from perhaps the way that everyone's talked about it. And so I'll just read you this bit about blended Scotch whisky at the start of the 20th century. And it's interesting because you said, well, what surprised you? I think it was when I read in a trade journal someone using the word craze, which didn't strike me as a late Victorian word, the craze for blended Scotch whisky, that I really realized how popular it was and how people were taken aback by this. It was something that sort of come from nowhere, you know, from the sequestered glens, you know, and pushed into London by people like Walkers and Greenlees. And crazy it was, you know, crazy it absolutely was. As a new century dawned on the Edwardian age, the triumph of blended Scotch whisky might at first sight have seemed complete. In cities and towns throughout the kingdom, brands such as Watson's, Buchanan's, Whitehorse and Usher's bellowed their names at consumers from enormous hand-painted advertising hoardings. I think we forget actually that because all we see in books and stuff are old newspaper ads, we forget that the principal means of advertising were posters, huge hand-colored posters that you would see on the tram, on the bus, you know, all over across the cities in the UK, and eventually, of course, into the United States, into New York and Chicago, whatever.
When you were getting your deli sandwich, Andy.
When you were getting your deli sandwich, I've been there, Andy. By the way, it's a killer, isn't it? It's an absolute killer. Ordering breakfast is even worse, actually. I always found, but there you are. On London's embankment, bewildered consumers were faced with a giant electric-lit Highlander who, with kilt and sporran swinging in the wind, spent the night and possibly the day drinking from a thistle-shaped glass of scotch. In the weekly magazines, the Illustrated London News and the Graphic, brands like Oldham, Var and Robertson's vied for a share of voice with the bigger brands. High-class grocers and wine and spirit merchants boasted in provincial newspapers of their own bottlings of both blended and sometimes single Scotch whiskies, alongside their stocks of proprietary brands. Whilst Lipton's, supermarket famous for their tea, whilst Lipton's were selling their 15-year-old kiosk liqueur whiskey, the cream of Scotch whiskies, at discount prices, a sort of oldie of the early 20th century. Ornate mirrors and elaborate signs declared the virtues of one or other whiskey brand and decorated the walls of public houses the length and breadth of the country. And only a few years earlier, caged parrots, we all know what I'm talking about here, right? Caged parrots had been employed to call out the name of one very particular brand in the capital's most stylish bars. Blended Scotch was to be found in every corner of the British Empire, as well as in bars and hotels from New York to San Francisco. The Americans, someone wrote, the Americans are inclined to turn liking into mania, as it was with the bicycle, with golf and buttons, so it was with Scotch whisky, which suddenly and without apparent cause became the fashionable drink. An advert in the Singapore Free Press declared, Scotch whisky is the universal beverage. Fashionable society and the establishment were apparently smitten. In the city of London, quote, men who formerly drank wine at lunch take whiskey and Apollinaris or soda instead. In catering for this class, quality is an indispensable necessity. Malt whiskies, either single or blended malts, are unsuitable here also, for as a rule, these do not go well with mineral water, and are besides usually too heavy for the purpose. In the West End's clubland, a whiskey bottle and soda siphon ruled the table. At London's Carlton Hotel and the leading smart feeding grounds of society, one sees even the ladies preferring the whiskey and soda to champagne. The society lady, wrote one observer, without hesitation takes whiskey and does not scorn to be helped from the bottle which is advertised in every paper. Ladies, wrote another, take a great deal more wine than they used to at dinner, and they also indulge in frequent liquors and whiskey and sodas. The Sportsman advised readers concerned that drinking might be a cause of obesity. At the end of year prize giving of the Gravesend Bird Fanciers Society, bottles of Walker's special Scotch whisky, black label, were liberally dispensed for the winning displays of pigeons and rabbits. Polite society admired the adventures of war correspondent Lady Sarah Wilson, who greeted guests at her bomb-proof shelter in Mafeking in South Africa with scotch and soda and cigarettes. And they were horrified by the news, hot from the war front, of a whiskey famine in Ladysmith. The upright was scandalized by the long-running Chandos Pole divorce case, where the principal indiscretions seem to have occurred while the accused parties were drinking whiskey and soda and smoking until the early hours of the morning. Amongst the barber's accessories, clocks, barometers, telescopes, rubber goods, unspecified sherry, champagne, and Australian brandy, packed by the American Ladies Hospital ship Maine, sailing to offer respite for British troops in the Cape, were 10 cases of Buchanan's Special Scotch whisky. Another blender, Dewars, offered 2,000 bottles to the Lord Mayor of London's Equipment Fund for the London Imperial Corps, who were heading to the South African War. During the summer at the seaside, whiskey distillers were sponsoring brand-themed sandcastle building competitions for children. Sorry, that's crazy. I'll read that one again. During the summer at the seaside, whiskey distillers were sponsoring brand-themed sandcastle building competitions for children. It's true. One distiller in question said he did not think it wrong, that he did not think that wrong could be made by getting children to construct certain letters with shells. You wouldn't get away with that one these days. At Bournemouth Theatre Royal and Opera House, families at the pantomime, Little Red Riding Hood as it happens, were dazzled by the spectacle of the courtyard and later the gorgeous tableau of the Grand Salon, where festivals were the order of the day at the Hotel de Whisky. It's a pantomime, right? Hotel de Whisky. Meanwhile, for insomniac readers of the Norfolk News Sheet, Dr. W. Gordon Stables recommended Scotch whisky to be taken only after food, in bed, the nightcap, and the evening paper. The way that Scotch whisky pervaded every aspect of British culture in the late Victorian and Edwardian and then onwards into the 30s and 40s was absolutely astonishing. And that actually surprised me. I hadn't and there's lots in here about music hall and all that sort of stuff as well. But blended Scotch was everywhere. I mean, talk about a takeover. It was quite astonishing. And if you find that interesting, obviously you need to buy the book to read the rest.
Highly recommended. It's a wonderful book. Wonderful.
Thank you, Charlie. Yes, thanks.
I'm going to give up writing altogether, actually. It's so much better than anything I've ever written.
Nonsense. I won't trouble anyone with any more, because I know if anyone is watching, they probably need to get to bed as well. But just a couple of different bits from it anyway.
Well, I don't think Andy was ready for the lighting situation for the sun to go down where he is, but sorry you're still here, Andy.
Yeah, I'm a tad pale as well. It's not a good look with very bright lights. Spend a bit more time out in the vitamin D.
The other interesting thing that's interesting about Johnny Walker, and I'm just reminded of that because I'm drinking this, perhaps strangely, absolutely delicious White Horse from the 1980s. And I can assure you that that White Horse would not have been quite so delicious had the Distillers Company not decided to withdraw Johnny Walker Red Label from the UK market in 1977, which was an absolutely disastrous decision for the brand in the UK. And if you think of people, the distillers here will understand, if you think of the way that Walker at the time was selling over 1 million cases in the UK, it had been almost next to nothing after the Second World War, but had come back really strongly in the late 60s and 70s. So you have to imagine that the DCL production committee were planning ahead to, I guess the spirit there was about 7 or 8 years old. So they got 7 or 8 years old worth of inventory, banking not just on it being 1 million cases a year, but actually probably substantially in excess of that. 1.5 million, 2 million probably was their ambition. And suddenly that's taken out. And people talk, of course, about the whiskey lock, but it's really, I think it's the red label lock. You know, it's the red label lock. And what happens within the DCL is that eventually they just have to get rid of this whiskey, and you just have to get rid of it, which I can imagine malt whiskey enthusiasts, of which occasionally I'm one, will be weeping at the thought of all that whiskey that could have been kept from all of these distilleries that were eventually closed. But it meant that brands like White Horse were hugely overspecified in the 1980s. Yeah, I was going to say something that I was told confidentially, so I probably won't say that. But let's just say hugely overspecified.
Have a dram.
So, you know, if you're ever looking at whiskey auctions and stuff, and you're not sure what to buy, if you can pick up a bottle of White Horse or any decent blend from the 80s, I'm just spreading the love, Sam. I'm spreading the love.
There goes my deal. That's the last thing I could afford at an auction. Fuck's sake.
Everyone needs to know. Everyone needs to taste these blends because they're so great. They really are so great. So that's my final piece of advice on that.
No, it's sound advice, and hopefully it brings back the reputation of the great blended whiskey. It is a category, it is a spirit whose potential hasn't been fully realized in recent years. I think it's fair to say. I think that we have focused too much on malt. And not that there's anything wrong with that, but a single distillery in Scotland, the way they produce now, is more difficult to produce quite the diversity of flavor that you described in the book. Certainly in the toddy style, the big oily, who's that today? But even more modern style of sitting on stock until it's right, using 30-year-old whiskey in no age statement blended Scotch whiskey, which some blenders do, and myself included. There's such great potential in that spirit.
Absolutely.
Brought to you by Green Isle. Right? I'm gonna do that, isn't it? Yeah, I'm gonna do it.
Shameless.
I'm not a cheat. Let me tell you this. A few moments ago, I was listening to Nick Morgan read from his recently published book in the company of you guys on my fucking laptop. I felt like I was dreaming. I felt like this is impossible. Why would we be doing this? But of course, here we are. Yeah, it is right. Yeah. Have you seen the re-updated Twilight Zone? Anyway, I'm so grateful to be here. Does someone keep trying to pipe up and I'm speaking over them?
Yeah, I was just going to say something. This moment reminded me of, as Doc read from the book, it reminded me of as a kid when you were sitting around home, like with your grandparents, and they were reading a story, and the pace that you were reading at allowed me to visualize. And as kids, that's what we loved about storytelling, is it was always done at a pace that allowed your mind to capture an image and to project what that must have been like at that moment. And that, to me, is really what's been cool about this evening. The stories have been such that you get a chance to try to imagine what it must have been like sitting around and visiting one another's house and having to have a drink, and then you have to go to someone else's house and have another drink, and you realize some of the things that we miss in the world today are the things that, when we reflect back on our lives, that we cherish the most. It would be nice if we could go back and do this again, maybe at another point, and listen to how our stories and these new bourbons and whiskeys that are being created continue to evolve and hopefully make us better people as we walk this earth and tell stories to others of our journey so far.
Amen.
Oh, so true, so true. Let's make this a regular event. Sam.
Well, I'd absolutely love it. If you're being serious, Charlie. Sorry?
Yeah, swapping stories, talking, sitting around the fire, whatever.
I promise we'll start at 7 next time.
There's a thing that's not in the book, but I'd love to read it next time if we do on Sam, which is the description of the party that they had in the cellar of Walker's London office when George Paterson Walker got married, and it's just such a beautiful vignette. It's a classic. I'll save that for next time.
We certainly owe John another tasting. I know another event like this. John, I know you had a few stories in there, but we didn't get a full time with you. I wanted to share some of the Opinions Matter content you guys have done. I wanted to tell stories of us being together on Islay or in New York and around the world together. Let's do this again. And you guys all know we aren't the best storytellers in the industry. There's tons. There's tons. We are all great storytellers, and there's so many others I'd love to invite to this, and maybe perhaps we could do it again. So. Thanks for that. Thanks a lot for being here. I want to, because John, I think we will just need to move on and call it a night so we can get Charlie to bed safely, including getting my wife to bed safely. You can hear the kids are already down, so that's good. My friend Kat Spencer sat around a fire earlier tonight and sang a song. I'd love to put that on to wind us out. I'll then put on some thank yous on the screen, but you're all welcome to leave at that point if you like. Again, listen, it has felt like a strange dream. Thank you so much for doing this.
Thank you, Sam.
Thank you, Sam.
Thank you for bringing us together, Sam.
Yeah.
Salute. Cheers.
Time is coming, and the trees are sweetly glowing.
Remember, remember, the 5th of November, gunpowder, treason, and plot. I know of no reason why the gunpowder treason should ever be forgot. Remember, remember, the 5th of November. Remember, remember, the 5th of November. I know of no reason why the gunpowder treason should ever be. Why the gunpowder treason should ever remember the 5th of November. Remember, remember, the 5th of November. I know a reason why the gunpowder treason should ever reason why the gunpowder treason should ever reason why the gunpowder treason should ever reason the 5th of November. I know a reason why the gunpowder treason should ever 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 be forgot.